Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch, and if you're looking to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today we are doing chapter 18 of Breaking Step. Tibs crouched at the edge of the roof, looking as a group of urchins were escorted to a more ostentatious house. Two boys and a girl, each holding a child. 6 seemed to be the size each couple took in. He didn't know what rules govern which runners they got, but he'd yet to see a group with more than half of it children too young to go in the dungeon. Well, he thought they were too young, and they hadn't been in at the training. They were too young, and they hadn't been to training. But he'd find out when the first teams of Omegas were sent in, if that meant anything. The men and women were dressed to match the house, more like successful merchants than even low nobles, but still apart. Not every couple who took in Omegas were together. Some had been assigned to each other by the guild. There had been negotiations. Serba had told him that, so most were okay with who they were partnered with, but she hadn't been interested in looking into who those people were for him. They're people, she told them, rolling her eyes. That's all I care to know about. That's all I care to know about them. The man welcomed welcomed the children. No, the urchins. The men welcomed the urchins warmly while the woman stood away and didn't react to their presence. The two had argued before the urchins arrived, but Tibs hadn't cared to bring the words to him and find out what about. The urchins got a roof over their head and people who'd be there to comfort them if they returned from their runs. He'd do checks to ensure no one took advantage of them, but otherwise, Tibs felt the situation was acceptable. The urchins remained closed in, even as the man laughed at something he said. There was no light on the laughter, not so an honest one. Tibs had known not all laughs were real, but he'd been surprised the first time one had come with light. He laughed as the man ushered the Omegas inside. There was another house he wanted to check on. The couple there had smiled as they welcomed the runners, but while Tibs hadn't heard what they'd said, he'd seen the light as they spoke. They, he suspected, had plans for the runners, and Tibs was going to ensure they didn't come to fruition. Hurry! The runner by the door to the shop's basement called. I think I see them. Tibs extended his senses, feeling for details that would confirm those were the guards on their way to Red Tibbs's equipment stash. He shook his head when Jackal glanced his way. Not them. No swords at their hips. No metal buckles on armors. They still had time. Tibs had hurried to gather everyone he could on finding the paper warning him of the raid under his tankard when he'd returned to his stable. It had meant Quigley and his team, Jackal, and the runners who'd been in the inn, 1 and 3. Fortunately, they all had an element, and it made moving the crates containing the equipment easier. Once everything was moved to a temporary location, Tibs took position on a roof facing the shop and waited. The group of guards was 8 strong when they arrived. The woman in the lead showed a paper to the shopkeeper, and he stepped out of the way. When they exited a few minutes later, she wasn't happy. She questioned the merchant before rejoining the others in the distance. Tibs waited until they were out of his range before stepping down and checking with the merchant. The paper had explained what they were doing, he told Tibs. In this case, searching for illegal weapon and armors. They had to present the paper to the owner before to the building's owner before they could act on it, and it needed to be signed by the magistrate of the law, who needed to be convinced something illegal had happened. In most towns throughout the kingdom, the position was assigned by the king or one of their stewards. But in a dungeon town, the leader of the guard was automatically that person. So again, the guild could do whatever it wanted. What do you know about the magistrate of law? Tibs asked Jackal as the team ate. The fighter snorted. Nearly impossible to buy, and the one the king employs can't be bribed. That's your king? Tibs asked for clarification. Or are they all like that? What he wanted to find out was the information applied to whatever kingdom they were in. They're not, Don said, then looked at his plate. Then the question was, how many coins would it take? Could a king decide to assign one to a dungeon town? Don stared at him. Of course not. The guild is in charge here. But they're taking advantage of the kingdom's citizen, Tibs pointed out. They are not, Commodore said. We're in the kingdom, Tibs stated. Not officially, Don said, then shrunk in under Tibbs's, Jackal's, and Mez's stare. He took a breath and straightened. Dungeon towns are considered to be part of the guild's kingdom, regardless of where they're located. The guild has a kingdom? Tibbs asked in disbelief. Technically, Tibbs glared, not in the same sense as what the kingdoms are, the sorcerer said, but because they're all governed the same way by a central organization, they are considered a kingdom. In actuality, it's just more like the city-states that existed before the guilds came to be, where each was able to hold the kings around them at bay through variety of alliance or access to things that couldn't be obtained anywhere else. When we came here, we agreed to become a citizen of the guild's kingdom. I never agreed to something like that, Mez said. Don shook his head. We're different. We came here as part of a transaction. They can't sell my citizenship, the archer stated. You weren't a citizen when it happened, Don replied. You were a criminal. We all were. And we lost our citizenship when we were thrown into cells, he hesitated, with a possible exception of Tibbs. I was in a cell. But you're straight. They always show up in a town they always show up when a town becomes a city, no matter what's done to keep them from happening. But no one wants them there. So many kingdoms simply don't acknowledge them, going so far as to not accept. The people living there as their citizens and granting them the base rights citizens get, like making sure the guards keep them safe from abuse by the nobility? Mez asked. Don snorted. Guards need money like everyone else, and when it suits them, nobles have no problem giving it to them. He took a breath to calm himself. All I'm saying, as it applies here, is that it's possible Tibbs wasn't even a citizen of his kingdom. And how did being prisoners lead to all of you becoming citizens of the guild without your approval being needed? Commodore asked. The same way any commodity changes ownership. We were sold. The urchins? Tibbs asked. War makes things different, the sorcerer said. The winner makes the laws, and not every kingdom is kind to the loser. Some will punish even those who didn't take part in the fighting. As bad as them being here is, it could have been worse. Being sold as house servant is common, Commodore said, and that's among the least horrible things that could happen, Don said. Taking advantage of the losers is a grand tradition in some kingdom. You're talking about betting the children of those who fought, Jekyll said, disgusted. Don's expression was answer enough. You seem quite knowledgeable in the ways of kingdoms, Don, Commodore said. The sorcerer shrugged. When you're in a hurry to raid through a library's shelves, you can't stop to choose what you read. So, there's nothing anyone can do to keep the guild from just taking anything they want from the people in town? Tibbs asked. Then why did the guard bother with the paper? Don looked at the others questioningly. Tibbs' stash was raided, Jekyll said. And before they entered, the lead guard showed the paper to the shopkeeper, Tibbs added. Why? If Ferdinand can do anything he wants. Because the guild wants people to come here, Don said, shrugging. They need commerce for the town to prosper. They need runners who weren't criminals to pay to test themselves against the dungeon. Not a lot of people want to come to a city where they'll never know if they're safe. Following how things are done in the kingdom is a way to show they'll be as safe as where they come from. Unless the guild doesn't feel like doing that, Jekyll said. Don nodded. That's the thing we need to remember. The guild follows those procedures because they want to, not because they have to. Same as with many of the kings. Mess said, not exactly. Kings have rivals who can be convinced to act if the population is in turmoil. If the citizens aren't happy with who you're targeting, it's easier to get them to help you during the war. So there's only so far a king can go outside the rules before they have to face the consequences. So there's no one we can go to force the guild to treat us better. Don shook his head. Even if we were citizens of the kingdom and there was a magistrate of law here, you couldn't get them to protect you from Erdian. The guild is simply too powerful. Why is he even bothering with Tibs? As asked, he's helping. I'm breaking the rules. What Tibs is doing, under the law, Jekyll said, under the laws, Jekyll said, is a protection racket. It doesn't matter that the merchants approached him and that he's protecting them even if they can't pay. It doesn't matter the real reason, probably because he's doing a better job than the guards. He's breaking the law, so he needs to be stopped. But only according to established procedures, Don added. Comdor added, and Don nodded. Until Erdian decides he's done with Tibs, Jekyll said. Who happens to have Tyrannia's blessing, Don added. Okay, but the stash was stuff Tibs uses to help the runners, Mez said. How's that breaking any law? He has too many, Don said. Even the most generous kingdom controls how well citizens can be armed. One or two swords per adult will be acceptable there, but Tibs has enough to equip a small group of mercenaries. Then, Jekyll said, them getting that paper done is what gives whoever told us about it time to do it. Them having get. Then, Jekyll said, them having to get that paper done. Cursor, where's my cursor? There you are. Is what gave whoever told us about it time to do it. Possible. Without knowing who it was, it's not possible to know. It's not possible to be certain. Don looked at Tibs, who shrugged. Then we just have to keep them in shops, and we'll always know ahead of time, and we can move them. That is placing an unreasonable amount of trust on this mysterious person, Commodore said. How many times can this happen before the guards realize there is someone informing you? How quickly will they ensure it stops? Or use it to catch you in the act, Don added. Not to mention how disruptive it's going to be to the merchants. If Tibbs alienates them, he's going to lose the money he needs to help the Omegas. Well, we can't just leave them where they are, Jekyll said. If you know who gets wind of it, not going to hear the end of that. Tibbs nodded. Krosef had agreed to store the crates in the inn cellar, but if his father found out, it didn't matter how much he'd done for the town or that Jackal was Krosef's special man. They'd be paying for it. A whistle sounded and the door closed. Tibbs stretched his sense, and 2 blocks away felt the guards approaching. He shrugged when Jackal looked at him. It wasn't like there was anything he could do. The signal was more for those to hide what they didn't want the guards to notice than to provide time to run. It still caused a commotion as the guards pushed the runners who decided now was a good time to head out. It got loud until Krosef pulled them out to make space. He glared at anyone unhappy with his intervention. He glared down. Anyone unhappy with his intervention. The guard in the lead was the same woman who'd spoken. He glared down and not at anyone. The guard in the lead was the same person who'd spoken to the shopkeeper. Krosef spoke with her, then stepped aside, looking in their direction. Should we? Jekyll started, but Tib shook his head, watching the 4 guards approach. Tibs Lightfinger, she said, looking them over before settling her gaze on him. You are being brought in for interfering with the safety of Craggle Rock. If you resist, I've been authorized to restrain you. We have a run tomorrow, Jekyll said, raising his tankard. Come back after that? He took a swallow, eyeing her. If those are important to you, she replied, you should ensure no one on your team breaks the rules. How has Tibbs interfered with the safety of the town? Commodore asked. As far as I am aware. Nope. No contraction. Commodore, that is not how you speak. As far as I am aware, he saved the town twice. He's been seen casing houses the new residents have moved in. With plans to break in and cause trouble. You mean those houses where they're working the runners under their care to exhaustion? Jekyll asked. There's been no report of unacceptable behavior on the part of the caretakers, she replied flatly. And is that because the guild doesn't care what they do? Don asked, or because none of the Omegas know to go to them for protection? Why they aren't, she stopped as Tibbs stood. Tibbs, don't just go with them. Jekyll stood. I'm not going to cause any problem, Tibbs said, locking eyes with the fighter. Not here, not elsewhere. I'm sorry you're going to miss the run because of me. The Abyss takes the run. The Abyss take the run. Jekyll growled. This is just because that boss of yours doesn't like Tibbs. She shrugged. The complaint came from citizens through the proper procedures. They surrounded Tibbs as he headed for the door. Tibbs could use the time to figure out how he was going to ensure those people didn't get to take advantage of the runners under the care once he was out of the cell. The cell's door shut behind Tibbs, and he looked at the occupant, trying to ignore how the weave pressed against him. There weren't as many, but they looked no friendlier than those from his previous stay. 2 days, the guard said, as he had Tibbs hand over his knives, bracers, and pouch, was the duration of his stay this time. He'd then patted him down to make sure he had nothing hidden. It would be plenty of time to plan. A massive man stepped forward, grinning nastily. Once Tibbs had dealt with this. Well, the man said. I didn't know runts got thrown in with the big boys. I'm going to have fun with you. Do you see my eyes? The man snorted. Magic don't work in here. That's not what it should tell you. Tibbs closed the distance before he was done speaking. Then the man was writhing in pain on the floor from the half-dozen well-placed strike. Now, he said, looking at the others in the cell, I need time to think. So if you're considering making my time here difficult, try it now. I hope you learned your lesson, Erdogan said as he opened the cell's door. If he was disappointed Tibbs was unarmed, he didn't show it. That he was here confirmed that whatever other reason there were for Tibbs to stay in the cell, Erdogan had used it to make a point. He headed for the exit to retrieve his possession in silence. And this concludes Chapter 18 of Breaking Step. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter is going to be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read the story, it is available for free on Royal Road. If you want to support me, my Patreon is about 20 chapters ahead of Royal Road. And if you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. The links are in the note. And with that, I shall wish you a good day.